Hello and welcome to the Soil Health Bootcamp webinar series. My name is Kerry Rivard and I'm a fruit and vegetable extension specialist with the Department of Horticulture, Forestry, and Recreation Resources at Kansas State University. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about more advanced information about cover crops and how to integrate them into vegetable crop production. So during our webinar today, we'll talk about a few basic considerations of what you want to get out of the cover crop and some of the goals of the cover crops that you're going to use in your vegetable production. And then we'll talk a little bit about the traditional use of cover crops and some different scenarios where we can utilize cover crops for both warm season and cool season vegetables. Then we'll talk about some non-traditional uses of cover crops, including interplanting, living mulches, and some other things like that. And finally, we'll wrap up with no-till production, which utilizes high residue cover crops, typically as a mulch, in order to suppress weeds and conserve water during the vegetable or cash crop. Most of us are familiar with the major benefits of using cover crops and have been covered in previous webinars during this series. But keep in mind that each cover crop species is going to have a different major benefit or a different function that it adds to the agroecosystem. Some of them have multiple functions, some of them have a lot of overlap, but depending on what the goal is and what you want to get out of the cover crop, you may want to use different species. There's also a number of challenges that exist with cover crops. Oftentimes it's very difficult to incorporate cover crops, mainly due to logistics and developing a production plan. And this can be a major barrier for many growers. So we'll talk about some of the scenarios that we can utilize for both warm season and cool season crops. Another big issue for people that are new to utilizing cover crops is just managing the large amount of biomass that a cover crop can produce. So here in this picture on the right, you can see a cereal rye cover crop that's planted in the fall and typically terminated in the spring. And you can see cereal rye can get as tall as 6 or even 7 feet, depending on the fertility levels in the soil and the environmental conditions. So for many growers, this can be a very daunting issue because if you don't have the right equipment to manage this biomass, then it's going to be very difficult to utilize cover crops. Now, later in the webinar series, we'll be talking more about equipment and other ways to terminate cover crops. In this one, we just want to recognize that as a challenge. This can also be an issue with cover crops, and many people have brought this up before when trying to decide whether or not to utilize cover crops, and that's the issue of regrowth. So in this case, we were utilizing a cover crop called tillage radish, and tillage radish is a very interesting crop in that if you plant it before summer solstice, it will immediately flower, or otherwise known as bolt, and produce seed. And that seed can lead to regrowth during the same season. In this case, this was actually a no-till pumpkin study that we had at the Wichita Research Station, and we were utilizing only spring cover crops for our experiment to determine if there were some spring cover crops that would work well for pumpkins. One of the things that we found out in the name of good science is that tillage radishes are a very poor cover crop for pumpkins in the spring, because what happens is they immediately go to seed, they don't produce very much biomass, and then you get regrowth during the production season, which actually competes with those pumpkins, as you can see here. So some basic considerations for utilizing cover crops is one is to identify the goal of the cover crop. So this picture shows a farmer that's located just south of Lawrence named Jerry Wallets, and Jerry is a strawberry grower and also grows a few other vegetables as well, but his main crop is strawberries. Now, strawberries need very good soil health, good soil quality, and so one of the things that he wanted to do based on his soil type and the history of his farm is increase the organic matter substantially during the summertime, which is the off-season for strawberries. One of the most important considerations for utilizing cover crops is the timing of your cash crops and when the off-season is so that you can integrate cover crops into your overall production plan. So in this case, Jerry is growing annual strawberries. Strawberries are planted in the fall, grown through the winter, harvested in the spring, and then the field is actually cleaned out during the late spring, and a cover crop is planted in the summer. So you can see in the lower left-hand corner how that summer cover crop integrates into his overall production system. So this is basically the traditional use of cover crops, in that we want to utilize cover crops during the off-season in order to build organic matter, suppress weeds, provide fertilizers or other things for that cash crop that's going to follow it immediately afterwards. This slide shows a few basic scenarios for the traditional use of cover crops. And oftentimes people only think of winter cover crops as being useful for vegetables, but keep in mind that many of our vegetables that are most profitable are the ones grown in the spring and in the fall, especially here in Kansas and throughout the Midwest, where we can have very difficult growing seasons during the summer. So for traditional warm season vegetables, oftentimes we'll utilize a winter cover crop, something like rye or winter wheat that would be planted late in the fall, sometime around October 15th up to November 1st. And then that winter cover crop will get terminated early in the spring, preferably about 30 days prior to planting your cash crop, because that's going to provide enough time for those microbes in the soil to chew up that cover crop and make the good stuff in there available to that cash crop. Or, for some growers, if your vegetable crops or your cash crops go late into the year, you don't have time to actually get a winter cover crop planted, many growers will find a lot of benefit out of utilizing just a spring cover crop, such as spring oats, that can help build organic matter in the spring prior to planting. Now for cool season vegetables, you're going to take the opposite scenario. Instead, you basically have spring and fall cash crops at the beginning and the end of the year, and then you're going to use a summer cover crop such as sorghum Sudan grass that I showed earlier with strawberries, or you could utilize something like buckwheat, sun hemp, or cowpeas. And those would be very excellent summer cover crops here in Kansas to utilize between cool season crops. Last but not least, don't forget that there are a small number of true fall cover crops. Those are cover crops that are cool season plants but get winter killed. So this would include oats, and would also include tillage radish as well. Now those cover crops can be really useful and really beneficial for a number of reasons, and I'll talk about some of that later in terms of managing and terminating that cover crop. However, the important thing is that typically they have to be planted a little bit earlier than a winter cover crop. So for example, in the case of tillage radish, you really want to get those in the ground sometime around August 15th to September 1st. So if you're following a cash crop, it needs to be one that's pretty short and is already finished by August 15th to September 1st. For example, something like green beans or cucumbers are examples of short window, warm season cash crops. This figure came from Eliot Coleman's New Organic Grower, and this figure is actually getting a little bit dated. But one of the things that I really like about what Eliot has done here is he's shown a way to put together a production plan that includes both a crop rotation with cash crops and cover crops. And so I think that's a really helpful mechanism for planning out a production season for the grower. So what you can see is on the left-hand side, it shows all of his plots or his zones or his fields, however you want to call them. And then the cash crops are on the top half of the section, and the cover crops are on the bottom half. So you can see over the course of 3 years how those bounce between cover crops and cash crops and back and forth. And that's a nice way of identifying which ones are cash crops and which ones are cover crops within your overall production plan. So as I mentioned, one of the main things to determine is which cover crops you want to grow. And this really depends on which cash crops you're growing, whether it's cool season or warm season. The other thing to really consider is if you want to utilize a cover crop that's winter killed. And this really includes oats and radish primarily. The big advantage to utilizing winter killed cover crops is that they don't require a lot of equipment to terminate. I identified this earlier as a major challenge for utilizing cover crops, is you need a large mower or some other way to kill that cover crop and get it incorporated into the soil. The nice thing about winter killed cover crops such as oats and radish is during the winter time they get totally frozen, dry down, desiccate, and all you have to do in the spring is just till them in or you could no-till plant right through the residue. There's also some other cover crops that are a little bit easier to manage than things like rye and sorghum Sudan and sun hemp, which grow very tall, and I kind of call these the gateway cover crops. These are cover crops that farmers can use that may not have a lot of large specialized equipment for terminating that cover crop. And in general, these are ones that are going to grow lower biomass. Still plenty of biomass to add organic matter to the soil, but not so much that it's difficult to manage it. So winter wheat is an excellent example of this. It has many of the same basic functions that cereal rye does, but it only grows to about half the height. And so that makes it very easy to utilize and terminate. Similarly, buckwheat during the summer is a plant that only gets about 24 to 30 inches tall. It's easily cut down with a weed eater, even a mower, because it's a relatively soft plant and it's not very difficult for a small mower to take it out. So these are the kinds of things you want to think about when trying to decide which cover crops to grow. Another consideration is whether or not you're going to be utilizing your cover crop as a source of nitrogen for your vegetable crops. Now this is a picture actually of just a home garden scenario. This is actually my home garden from several years ago, and what it is a mixture of winter wheat and annual crimson clover. Now that winter wheat has spent all winter picking up nitrogen from the soil and storing it in its shoots and leaves. And that annual crimson clover is a legume, so it's going to be fixing nitrogen out of the air and turning it into nitrate and ammonia that could be utilized by the plants. So in the spring, we can turn this stuff into the soil, and it's going to release nutrients, or really nitrogen, back into the soil and provide free fertilizer for our cash crops. And this does this by two major mechanisms: nitrogen recovery by the grass and nitrogen deposition by the legume. Now if you go into the literature, there's a book called Managing Cover Crops Profitably through the SARE publication series, and it actually identifies the way you can estimate the amount of nitrogen deposited or recovered by a cover crop. And essentially we can work with a few basic assumptions. One is the percent nitrogen in the tissue of that cover crop, and you can see the values listed here. These are ones identified in that book that I mentioned previously. Now one of the challenges to this is you do have to determine the pounds of biomass, and in this case this is dry biomass that's produced in your field. And so you may want to talk to your local extension person in order to identify ways to calculate the amount of biomass that's produced from your cover crop. Essentially, really all you have to do is cut some of that cover crop out, dry it down, weigh it, and multiply it in order to figure out how many tons per acre. However, this can be pretty challenging without the help of a university or extension collaborator. Now this picture actually shows a cover crop that was being grown in a high tunnel, and we're not going to talk about high tunnel production in this session, but we will in a further section in the webinar series. It is really important to utilize cover crops in high tunnels in order to proactively benefit the soil and increase soil quality. Now this was actually an experimental high tunnel that we were working in, and we were utilizing cover crop as a source of organic fertilizer for our organic tomato trial. In this case, we were actually able to sample the biomass and determine the percent nitrogen based on tissue analysis done in the lab. But you can also utilize that assumed percent nitrogen that's provided in that book, and I provided in an earlier slide. And what you can see here is basically that this cover crop right in front of you, it was actually rye and vetch mixed, was providing 83 pounds of nitrogen per acre to the tomato crop that was going to follow it. Now we typically like to give tomatoes around 100 to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre, so it's not quite enough, but it's certainly a great supplement for this crop. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the non-traditional uses of cover crops. In this case, we're not actually taking a field out of production to utilize cover crops, but we're integrating cover crops into the overall production field. So we can do this in a lot of different ways, and oftentimes we can take small sections of a field out of production and put it into a cover crop, but overall it's going to help out the overall field by attracting beneficials, and doing other things such as that. So this is a good example of how we can develop beneficial habitat without actually taking production fields out of use. So in this case, this is a high tunnel. High tunnels can be difficult to get pollinators into because the insects can get disoriented by the poly and the lack of UV light inside the tunnel. And so oftentimes it's very difficult to get pollinators to come inside them. Some folks will utilize bumblebees inside the tunnel. In this case, what we did was we actually planted annual crimson clover strip around the high tunnel, and it's going to help bring in beneficials and especially pollinators to help our crop. You can also utilize cover crops as windbreaks as well too. In this case, this is cereal rye, right? And so that cereal rye was planted fairly late in the fall, sometime around October 15th. It germinates and grows just a little bit in the wintertime, but in the spring it starts to grow very fast. And very quickly it can get 2, 3, even 5 feet tall. And so in this case what we did was we actually went through with a sickle bar mower and cut down that cover crop. Then we tilled it in using strip tillage essentially. And then you can see what's left behind is basically a corridor within the cover crop that we can plant our cash crop. And what this does is it provides a nice windbreak to keep those blowing early spring and early summer winds off of these young transplants. It's not uncommon, even in places outside the Midwest, for people to utilize rye and other things as windbreaks. And in fact, strawberry growers throughout the Southeast will oftentimes plant every 4th row into rye simply as a windbreak to keep sandy soils from tearing up their fruit. So you'll find that growers can realize a lot of benefits from this, not only in just maintaining good soil health. We can also utilize cover crops as living mulches. So in this case we have clover that's been planted out into this garden or production field. And essentially it was planted in the fall, again probably about the same time as rye, around October 15th, October 1st. And that clover grew through the winter. Keep in mind clover is a legume, so it's producing nitrogen that's going to get deposited back into the soil. And then in the spring what we did was we came through and we just tilled a strip right through that clover. And clover is a really soft plant. It's very easy to terminate and kill. You could mow it. I think in this case we didn't even mow it. We just tilled right through it and chopped it up a couple weeks prior to planting these tomatoes. Then what we did was we laid down fabric mulch over top of that terminated and tilled area and planted through the mulch, leaving this living mulch behind in the row middles. This can be a really nice way to manage weeds and also help provide protection for the soil in the row middles. One of the things that's really common is, especially if we get periods of wetness, when people are walking through the garden or through the field in order to harvest or plant or prune or do all those kinds of things, they tend to tear up that soil in the row middles very, very quickly. So one of the nice things about using these living mulches is it's going to reduce the amount of compaction that's happening. It's going to help maintain good soil structure as you're working through there. And of course it's going to help keep your feet dry and not muddy, which can also be kind of helpful as well too. And oftentimes folks in U-pick operations really like this type of management practice in order to help keep their customers happy and less muddy. So in this picture, that's exactly what you're seeing. This is a picture of a U-pick strawberry farm, and in this case they're planted annual rye in between the rows in order basically just to keep the mud down so that their U-pick customers are happier and have a more pleasant experience when they're out at the farm. But in addition to providing that, it's also providing a lot of ecosystem services to the soil as well. It's providing cover, preventing erosion. When rain events happen, it's really going to help protect the soil and prevent erosion from that as well too. And then it's also going to help add organic matter to the soil. And again, this is something one will always be doing. Now, one of the challenges with growing living mulches, especially between plastic, is trying to manage that edge where the living mulch hits the plastic. You can't use a weed eater up against plastic because that's going to tear it up. And so in this case, what this grower does is just uses a very small amount of glyphosate in order to just kill the weeds along the edge of that plastic row, and then mows everything in between. We've also used a similar practice during the summertime out at the Olathe Horticulture Center, but in this case we actually use sorghum Sudan grass in the row middles. Annual rye is a cool season plant, and so it's going to do well for spring and fall crops. But during the heat of the summer, you need something that can withstand the heat and the drought a little bit better. So in this case, we use sorghum Sudan. Now, one thing to keep in mind if you're going to be doing this is that sorghum Sudan grows extraordinarily fast. And in fact, if you get a rain, you can almost watch sorghum Sudan grow in this kind of scenario. So if you are doing this, you want to make sure you're letting growers know to be prepared to mow it pretty often, and especially watch out for when it rains, because when it does, they'll immediately respond, and you want to make sure you're out there mowing every 3 to 4 to 5 days until you hit another dry period. So last but not least, we're going to talk just briefly about no-till vegetables and things that and ways that we integrate cover crops into no-till systems. Unlike traditional row crops like corn and soybeans, no-till vegetable crops rely exclusively on the use of cover crops. Now, one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that not all crops do all that well in a no-till system, at least at this point. More research is being done in order to expand no-till practices into other crops, but for the most part, you really want to utilize very competitive crops that are able to develop a canopy very quickly and compete with the weeds in the landscape, because there still will be some weed pressure that you have to deal with. The other thing that we found is that no-till practices are going to be very detrimental to improving or increasing really soil temperatures. So if you leave that high residue biomass on top of the soil, it's going to provide a very nice mulch, but at the same time it's not going to allow that soil to warm up very quickly. So oftentimes people will utilize no-till systems for their late crops. For one, because it actually provides a benefit that the soil is a little bit cooler, but more importantly, in that case, they're not trying to get the very earliest harvest. And some growers that I've seen that have really good success with no-till systems are not growing their entire farm no-till, but instead they rotate blocks of no-till systems through the whole farm over the course of multiple years, and they use that block, for example, for their late planting of peppers, their late planting of tomatoes, or for things that don't need to be early, like winter squash and pumpkins. The other thing that we found is it can be very difficult to plant no-till crops that have very small seeds unless you're using transplants. If you're trying to plant carrots by seed or radish by seed, it's going to be very difficult to get the seed soil contact that you need in order to make that work. Now the no-till system, in addition to relying on heavy uses of cover crops, also relies especially on this machine right here. This is called a roller crimper, and we have one out at the Olathe Horticulture Center. You're going to get a chance to see one during the hands-on activities of the Soil Health Boot Camp. Now what this roller crimper does is it essentially rolls through the field and flattens down that cover crop in order to be a mulch. And oftentimes people wonder, well, why wouldn't you just mow down that cover crop? Well, one of the things that you want to keep in mind is that when you mow it, you're going to shred and cut up that tissue, which is just going to cause that decomposition of that tissue to happen even faster. We want that decomposition process to happen slower so that the mulch is able to provide protection and all those benefits throughout the course of the whole season. So if you mow it, you're speeding up that decomposition rate and maybe lessening the benefit of using that mulch. The other thing is that if you're going to use a mechanical planter for crops like pumpkins, sweet corn, beans, and others, then you really want to use that roller crimper because it keeps the plant together in one piece. When you cut up the plant and shred it up, then when you run a mechanical planter through there, it's going to mess up the mechanisms and cause a lot of issues as it tangles up that planter. So we've been doing work with no-till pumpkins for several years at K-State, and this is actually a picture of one of our experimental field plots. And what you can see in this picture is several treatments of different cover crops that are being grown. On the left is cereal rye that was planted in the fall. On the right is spring oats, and you can identify them. They're much more green than that rye is. In this case, those oats were planted right around the 10th of March, and if you get some decent spring weather, they can grow very fast and accumulate a lot of biomass very quickly. Now, about 2 weeks prior to planting the pumpkins, say around May 31st to June 10th, we'll come through with the roller crimper and basically flatten this down. And afterwards it would look something like this. So again, this is that field plot after we've rolled it and crimped it, and in this case we would just roll the whole field. And again, you can identify the spring oats on the right compared to the rye on the left. Now what you can see is after this roller crimper has gone through the field, it's going to make a nice flat surface and a thick mulch that you can plant that crop directly through. There are a few challenges that exist with no-till systems. I already mentioned the one about soil temperature. That can be kind of an issue, especially if you're trying to grow early crops. Now if you're not trying to grow things early, then it's not a problem at all. One of the other major issues that we've identified with no-till systems is that nutrient tie-up can also be a problem. So what happens with nutrient tie-up is all the organic matter that's in that soil, that's in that cover crop, is going to start to decompose the minute you kill it. Now, when the microbes and the fungi and everything living in the soil start to decompose those cover crops, they're also going to chew up nitrogen that's available in the soil and make it not readily available for the plants. So one of the things that we found out early on in our research was that if you just broadcast a whole bunch of fertilizer in the traditional way in a conventional tillage system at the beginning of the year as pre-plant fertilizer, it's going to get tied up very quickly by those microbes that are feeding on the roots and everything else related to that cover crop, and it's not going to be very available to the plants. So one of the things that we were able to do with our work is start utilizing fertigation more as a way to spoon feed that crop the nutrients that it needs, and therefore it's able to compete better and attain more of those nutrients over time. And that really helps to do that. Now we're not going to talk about fertigation today, but later on in the webinar series we will. The other thing that can be very difficult for organic growers in particular is terminating cover crops. We like to terminate cover crops with a roller crimper or with a flail mower, and conventional growers will oftentimes use glyphosate or another broad spectrum herbicide to kill cover crops. Now, if you're growing organically or in a certified organic system, you can't use those herbicides, and so this can become very difficult. One of the things, there's a lot of researchers that have shown that the timing of when you utilize that roller crimper has everything to do with how well you terminate it. And in the case of rye and other winter grasses or small grains, you want to terminate that rye when it's at the soft dough stage. So this is a picture of one of our no-till pumpkin trials out at the Olathe Horticulture Center, and what you can see is that residue was rolled down and it's still doing a very good job of suppressing weeds and also helping to maintain soil moisture. And in this particular year, we had very good results with our fall planted cover crops such as rye and vetch in combination. You can also utilize no-till systems for other crops as well too. This shows an example of some peppers being grown in a no-till system. Now, one of the things that we like to do, as I mentioned before, is utilize transplants as opposed to seeds, especially if you don't have a mechanical planter. Now, in this case, this was for our pumpkins, and we were growing using plugs in very small plots. And so we actually just used a small bulb planter to dig holes through the residue and just planted them that way. In this case, we were growing sweet corn in a no-till system, and similar to the pumpkins, we rolled down rye and vetch in the spring, and then planted that sweet corn through that residue in the early summer. And you can see we had very good luck with this sweet corn. It did very well, and we were able to get quite a few ears of corn off these rows. No-till plantings can also be really useful for cucurbit crops and other vining crops other than pumpkins. So in this case, these are watermelons growing here, and watermelons do well in no-till systems. Now you might notice a little bit difference in this picture. In this case, we've actually used fabric mulch in order to suppress the cover crop and also provide some added weed control for that watermelon. If you can get the watermelons grown big enough to cover that fabric mulch, then they're not going to have a problem with a few weeds out in the row middles and those kinds of things competing with them. So oftentimes we'll utilize fabric mulch as a way to do that. If you look on the left-hand side of this picture, you'll also see examples of no-till peppers and no-till tomatoes grown in the same manner. Similarly, this is a picture of no-till tomatoes where we've done pretty much the exact same thing. A rye cover crop was grown in the fall. It was terminated in the spring and rolled down, and then we basically just put fabric mulch right over top of that, and this is at an organic farm. And the nice thing about doing that is, especially in an organic situation, this is going to help prevent regrowth of that rye after you terminate it. And it's going to help prevent any weeds from developing around those tomatoes. Last but not least, you can also integrate no-till or cover crop residue methods with strip tillage. And in this case, we would not really call this no-till, you'd call it minimum tillage or strip tillage. So you can see there was a rye and vetch cover crop that was grown, planted in the fall, and then in the spring it was killed and just a small strip was tilled through that field where the plants were going to be planted. And what this does is it makes it easier to germinate seeds, it helps warm the soil a little bit faster, helps activate those microbes and helps stimulate some growth of those plants, and helps prevent some of those problems in terms of getting that nice early crop. Okay, so to summarize today, keep in mind that you want to find ways to integrate cover crops into everything that you do at the farm. You can utilize them in between crops in a traditional way, but you can also utilize them within your crops in the use of living mulches, windbreaks, beneficial habitats, and others as well. As you move forward utilizing cover crops, one of the things that you want to do is not really think about a cover crop individually, but think about a cover crop as a partner to your cash crop. You always want to be pairing up your cover crops with your cash crops and identifying combinations that work well. You also want to select cover crops that give the function or the benefit that you need. Oftentimes I will get phone calls from growers that are really interested in utilizing mustard as a cover crop. It gets a lot of attention on the internet. It's been shown to suppress weeds, which can be helpful through glucosinolate content and biofumigation process. But in reality, that cover crop provides very, very little organic matter to the soil. And if your major issue that you want to address is increasing organic matter, you probably want to go with something that gets a little higher biomass. And last but not least, don't forget that you do need to manage these plants. Now, most of the time when it comes to cover crops, we do very little management in terms of irrigation and even fertility. Some growers that have very sandy soils will find benefit of using a little bit of fertilizer, but most of us actually use no fertilizer whatsoever because that helps, again, recover the nitrogen that's already in the soil. That being said, there are some very specific practices that you want to be careful about, and a big one is planting date. If you plant cover crops too late, you're going to have issues getting enough biomass production in the fall, and so on and so forth. So make sure that you're managing those well because they are a long-term investment in your soil, which is a long-term investment in your farm. So I hope this has been very helpful to get a few examples of how to incorporate cover crops into vegetable crop production, and we look forward to seeing you next time.